Go. Today on Open Loops, we have somebody that I've wanted to have on for a long while now. Frank Jacob, international award-winning filmmaker, visual artist, musician, and composer. He is, well, some very interesting films. Solar Revolution, The Klaus Dona Chronicles, Hacking from Mars, and some of you may know him from the his work with Project Looking Glass and the seminar series he's recently run, A Tale of Two Timelines. How did we get here? I mean, he is on the edges of reality as we know it, and very much is just you can hear the New York City. It is reality because you can hear the New York City sirens in the background potentially. But Frank goes to the edge of it in his work and really well trying to open up more possibilities, which I'm all about, opening up new waves of consciousness through streams of thinking. So I'm very curious about all of it. We're gonna delve in. Frank, thanks so much for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me, Greg. Good to be here.
Yes, you are. What in the world? I mean, did you ever see yourself as being a voice in this community of all things? Now, I'm not even sure how you define this community, but I would say people that like things that are a little out there, fringe, spiritual people, the psychic UFO crowd, that kind of thing. I mean, was that ever on your trajectory in life? How'd you get here?
Well, I don't think it was the plan. Uh, uh, but I do. I mean, I did start in my life very early with some, very intense metaphysical type subject matter, and like I was into the Carlos Castaneda series when I was 14, and I'd read some of the stuff, the Seth material with Jane Roberts. So my mind was definitely open for the fringe of reality, for metaphysical topics. So, that I think that's kind of how I started. I didn't really have a trajectory. I knew that I wanted to do something in the arts, but at that point when I was kind of starting in my life, I was shooting more for music. And I figured I'd just go into the musical arts and become a wealthy rock star, and then maybe do a number on the world. I knew I wanted to do a number on the world, that's for sure. I just didn't know
Yeah.
what form it was going to take. So that's how, and then life just kind of sweeps you along, and whatever plans you have when you're 20 something, they tend to just, life sort of, the reality of the situation, paying rent and earning money, kind of throws you off a little bit if you're not born with a silver spoon in your mouth. So I took the long way. But I've, as a result of going into the arts, I developed skills with computers and musical instruments and software, and I was very familiar with editing music on a computer at the very, very start of that whole thing. And then, of course, video came afterward, when it was possible to compress video down to computers. So the whole idea of becoming it then morphed more into becoming a multimedia expressionist. Like, I just kind of figured technology was and instruments were my way of expressing. So that's kind of how it developed. And then when I was looking to make I'd done shorter films, for clients, and also for working for a network over I landed in Europe,
Yeah.
and I started cutting series for stuff for Red Bull, and shorter formats and mid-range formats. And then I wanted to do something like cinematic. And so that's how I kind of got into film. And that was about 12 years ago, I guess. And it just, the subject matter was like, well, what am I going to make a film about? And I knew it was going to be the documentary realm of filmmaking, because the idea of scripting and budgeting a film is a, for most people, unattainable. So, but
Yeah.
documentary filmmaking definitely wasn't. And I was familiar with making documentary, films as a result of my work at that network. So I just extended it from there, and I was looking for a subject matter. And I remember, well, I was scouring the web, and then I heard an interview from a couple of people talking about having been recruited for a Mars colony, and it sent me back to an earlier chapter of my life where somebody had pulled out this book called Alternative 3 and said, this is written as fiction, but it's actually the truth. And here were two people on this internet show talking about having been involved in a Mars-oriented, recolonization, recruitment thing. And I thought to myself, okay, is this really real? Because the book was amazing, but of course you don't think that it's real. It just, you figure it's fiction. And so
Yeah.
that was like, for me, the impetus to go down that rabbit hole and find out. For me, I just figured out, like, I'm going to go after this story and see where the universe takes me. And that's kind of how everything sort of went in that direction. And I'd never really veered away from that direction. I mean, I still do the straight-laced normie docs for customers,
Yeah.
but it's funny because those customers don't really know my alter ego, and the Clark Kent version of back and forth between super soldier stories and then super athlete stories or whatever, or cars, or trailers for cars and things like that. So they don't really cross over. Those two crowds never mix. So I
I was
never
gonna
had to
ask
worry.
about that.
Yeah,
Does
no, they don't tune in, they don't check it, they don't realize. Maybe if they did, they'd probably fire me or something. I don't know. They'd probably think, well, yeah, that Frank guy, he's kind of weird. Yeah, you know how normies are, right? So, but it's worked out fine. I mean, the thing is, I do make I am meticulous in how I approach the technology and my technique, the editing. It doesn't matter to me if I'm cutting a film about Mars or an Audi commercial. There's still a story to be told. There's still the best footage to select, and there's still, it's all about pacing and cutting, and I love that. So for me, it doesn't make a difference what I'm editing. I still try to do it as well as possible, and I guess I must do that, okay, because people keep hiring me. So yeah.
Yeah, no, no, no. Very interesting that I mean, I even think, when I think about other filmmakers. I mean, we'll put the forefront, the number one here, in terms of fictionalizing a lot of similar ideas. I mean, Steven Spielberg, right? This is a
Right.
guy. I'm sitting here going, well, this is a guy that was clearly very interested in aliens and very interested in extraterrestrials. And I even had a guy on, Mark Brinkeroff, who was a conscious walk-in. This guy who claims that he was the Spielberg's people interviewed him for E.T. I believe they sat down and interviewed him. So clearly, at some level, Spielberg, at the very least, if he doesn't fully believe it, he is willing to talk to people that do. But it does make me wonder, does a guy like him, do you think that there are a lot of people in Hollywood that really do know what's going on and they just have to make it all fiction? What's your take?
Well, I mean, it's interesting because we know a lot of people as a result, like me and my partner Tanya Maidenford. We know a lot of people in this genre now, and she knew more than I did. And when I first started on this journey, I knew nobody, and I just kind of went for the leads. And Tanya opened up a lot of doorways, and but one of the people that, I mean, we knew some people mutually, as it turns out, and I don't know if if I should say their names in respect to this topic, but I'll just say they're very well-known people worldwide. And they during the course of interviewing for Packing for Mars, they told us that that there is a group of authors, writers, filmmakers, and influencers that are used by the the underground military, or the black projects, the people that are kind of running these secret projects, this breakaway civilization, as we like to call it, that actually use a certain group of people to soft disclose
Mm.
information out into the world. So this is a fact. This does happen. This isn't, I mean, a lot of people talk about soft disclosure in Hollywood and Netflix and whatever, And yes, it is. But the fact is, they do select people, and they do give people privy to real information. Like, for example, I think in Spielberg's case, if I'm not mistaken, I think it was Alan Hynek
Hmm.
that was working on Project Blue Book, who was consulting and actually was, I think, even did a cameo in a Spielberg film, if I'm not mistaken, according
Yeah,
to his son.
yeah. And,
Yeah.
and
So
definitely Close Encounters.
yes, Close Encounters, right? I think that's the one it was. I think Paul Hynek is his son. He told us about that. So yes, he did make a cameo, and he was a consultant. I'm sure, absolutely. So I would be surprised if he didn't know, and if others in Hollywood didn't know. But of course, you want to be a fly on the wall a lot of times, but you aren't. You just have
I,
to kind of guess, and unless you know them personally.
I know.
And
I
I
was
know
gonna
a lot
say.
of people personally that that aren't necessarily on that level, but they confide that kind of stuff in us too. So yes.
That's what's interesting. And I've heard you talk about this in several interviews and conversations that you get a lot of intel, Frank, and that intrigues me. I mean, it's interesting. I mean, did that have to come with? I mean, you mentioned your partner. You mentioned that she probably is maybe was more deeply entrenched in the subject matter than you. But I'm kind of curious. Was there a point when you started? You made maybe you made your first film, and then people said, "Oh, this guy gets it." I'm reaching out to you. I want to tell you some stuff I know. I mean, was there a shift in your relationship? Did people just start coming out of almost like the Munchkins in Oz? I mean, did you start noticing different sources of information coming in your life in ways that you hadn't previously expected once you went to focus on the subject matter? How did that go for you?
Yes, I mean that definitely did happen. One of the first ways that I noticed it was when we began to when the film, for example, when Packing for Mars was released, we were then approached, because then it was like, because we didn't really approach like everyone and everyone. So I personally wasn't really known in the scene, in the whole, and I didn't really shoot for the UFO scene. I just wanted to make a cool film. I
Yeah.
didn't really care about the UFO scene or any of that stuff. So when we appeared with that film, it was out of nowhere. I mean, no one knew me. Tanya was better known, but not really that well known. I mean, like, yes, to a degree, she knew a lot of people. They knew her more than, and so when we came out with that film, it was kind of a out of nowhere bomb dropped into the scene, and not only that, but because it was, because it had a certain production standard that isn't common, it it made an impact, because up to then you'd heard there'd been films out, but the documentary filmmakers and the low budget disclosure UFO scene are not very skilled, or they don't have good equipment, or they don't have access to the state of the art that we did. Tanya works in Hollywood, even on real big budget films, and she's a craft, she's in the craft of making films, and I obviously hands-on working at a network, cutting every day, day in, day out, with the state of the art technology, have access to technique and abilities that none of these people did. So when that film came out, it created a whole new aesthetic. And the predecessor to that one was called Solar Revolution. And
Hmm.
we also made we won prizes, and that set a few milestones as well, because it was just this whole cinematic ethical approach to doing it, like high budget without the budget, because we are the actual, I mean, for me to hire someone like myself to sit there hundreds or thousands of hours to cut something would have been unattainable. But the very fact that, I was the director and the editor made it easy. And I had the gear. So it was possible to do something like that. And then once it was released, people, yes, we started having people approaching us. And, I mean, what's his name? Ken Johnson, was one of the first people that I met. That we were at UFO Congress in Phoenix, and we had just, we just come out with the film. It was 2016, I think it was February, and we aired it, we screened it, and we won People's Choice. But before we even won that we'd screened it, and I guess Ken had seen it, and he came walking up to where we had a little table, and I thought, and he introduced himself as this civilian astronaut who had actually worked on the Apollo program, and I thought, okay, here we go. He's gonna trash. He's gonna trash
Yeah.
everything, right? But as it was the opposite, he was actually so happy that we'd made this film that it connected so many dots for him, and then he pulled out all these interesting pictures and things that he gathered in his days when he was actually in charge of the photographic and film archive of the Apollo's material, and he had rescued a substantial amount of that material. As we know, a lot of it's disappeared, so we think anyway. And in his possession were shots that we had actually used in Packing for Mars, except we only had a smudged version. He had the clear version. So that was an interesting encounter. And then we had people calling us that were pissed because they weren't in the film, because they had intel about Mars, in particular, that they'd actually, how they used these giant lava tunnels that are under the surface of Mars to build and retrofit cities into, and they were actually involved in creating, technology for those cities and the infrastructure for those cities. And so, this began to happen. Yeah, absolutely. It was very, it's never, ever since then, we've never looked back. I mean, it's extended into every area. We've also made films about forbidden archaeology, about out of place artifacts with Klaus Donna, for example. And, we now have a network of people that are, that are in their possession, have in their possession artifacts that are obviously, if they're and they are real, but if they were acknowledged officially, that would mean we'd have to rewrite human history completely. So that's
Yeah.
interesting. So you realize then, okay, there really is something to all of this stuff. It isn't just some wacko, people out there that are mentally, psychotic or something, and have hallucinated all this stuff. No, these things, they do exist. So that was, I think, the most fascinating part. And yes, you find all of a sudden you are in touch with people that approach you, and you wish you could do more and have more time and have more money and all these things to make these films. Yeah.
So this is very interesting, in the sense that I'm always very drawn to what actually is tangible, the tangible evidence. I mean, it's very hard when, and I've never, fairness, I've never really gone to a UFO convention, but I feel that that would really, to be in the presence of people who have physical objects, or photographs that are clearly not just doctored online, stuff like that. I mean, that's a big difference. I guess I'm curious for the people out there that, you know, are so just they don't even believe that there is possibly that there isn't even life on Mars. I mean, what are you telling me that you've seen? Are you telling me you've seen actual photo evidence of the workstations on Mars? I mean, what is something that people would really that would blow people's minds to know about what's actually going on up there?
Well, we had from JJ Hertog, for example, we had him talking about the pyramids
Yes.
on the surface of Mars. And Credo Mutwa was another source that we got our hands on through JJ Hertog, because he was analyzing the pictures of what's called the Elysium quadrant on the surface of Mars, and these particular pyramids and the way they're arranged. And there was no doubt from the pictures that, I mean, it was JJ that actually got the original film, pictures from Jet Propulsion Lab back in the 70s. So
Yes.
he was one of the first people on the scene, even though he didn't later become, I mean, he did a lot of stuff very, very early. So, in fact, so early he beat the curve. That's one of those things that if your timing is in a way that you might have the goods, but the whole internet and this whole spreading of information didn't come until much later. So if you miss that window by 20 minutes, then you aren't going to be the name that everyone associates with. It's like Richard Hoagland. He was just ahead of the curve, of it.
Yes.
And and before him was JJ Hertog, and he showed us some pictures that we did incorporate them into the film. But they're also, one of the things that I regret not being able to put in the film was the material of John Brandenburg, and you can look that up on the internet. He's somebody, he was he's a physicist, and he worked on a lot of propulsion systems for NASA, and he was working with the telescope technology and propulsion technology, and he's come up with a whole series of super clear pictures of the Cydonia plateau, showing that this face on Mars, and this five-sided pyramid. He showed like some he's really got high resolution versions of these pictures that show without a shadow of a doubt. And I incorporated this later in a lot of presentations, live presentations that I would give, like the making of, where you can add this extra material.
Yes.
And so, and you can see pictures of what's happening beside this five-sided pyramid on Mars, and you zoom in on it and you look at the structures and ruins of Pompeii, and it's almost like the exact same architecture. And it's definitely not natural. So you realize that there were these, and you can see roadways, and this, and also like they find, a lot of the material that was found later has a certain similarity, uncanny similarity to South American art, that the kind of artwork that you find in and around the pyramids, the South American pyramids. And so we had that information didn't make it to the film, but it's information that proves that there was definitely an ancient civilization. And then you get into, like, I later got into the archives that were made public of the CIA, like the public access library they have, and I found a document from 1984 about remote viewing that had been done. And
Yes.
it's funny because I think a bunch of us found it around the same time. I definitely found it, and it was talking about having sort of remote viewed the surface of the planet and how a civilization existed there, and they had to leave because of what was happening, that their surface was being destroyed. So we have a lot of that kind of stuff periphery wise in Packing for Mars. We have Jerry Wills talking about that cataclysmic event that took place on Mars that matches up kind of with what these remote viewers were talking about. So a lot of it is, Greg, just kind of putting several different sources of material over top of one another, and that's how you can kind of confirm the difference between something that's just fake and something that really has real substance to it. It has archaeological foundation. It has parallels. You can even look into the culture of planet Earth, and there's like all these words, like hundreds of words in the English vocabulary that match up with Mars. Like they're words about Mars, about things that took place on Mars.
Wow.
And there's interesting. If you look at the city of the gods in South America and the way those pyramids line up, the moon pyramid and the earth pyramid and the Kukulkan pyramid, if you put a graph or like a picture of our solar system projected over top of those pyramids, and you place the sun at the place where the moon pyramid is, which actually should be the sun pyramid, and the earth pyramid where the moon pyramid is, then they all line up, and the Mars lines up with Kukulkan, who was supposedly the bringer of wisdom. And if you look at that whole layout of that plaza, the way it looks like when you leave the Kukulkan pyramid and you walk toward the moon pyramid, it's like a giant pathway. And it's almost like telling us in the history and the archaeological remnants left over that some civilization actually built the story into the layout of those ancient artifacts.
That is wild stuff. Everybody's gotta, I mean, look into these names. I've never seen Packing for Mars, but I gotta watch this movie now. I mean, it sounds really compelling. One of the interesting pieces in this, and I bring him up all the time. I brought him up in the the last conference we were doing, thrown by Watchers Talk and Full Spectrum Universe, Rob Yox and Omar Faizi over there. We were talking, and I always love bringing up the testimonial of Andrew D. Bashago. Now, here's what's interesting about this, and I found it so it's just a strange timing piece that 1984, with that remote viewing session, was around the time, and I think it was like 82, 83, that he
Hmm.
claims that he was doing work on Mars alongside, Lauren Eisenhower and Barry Soetoro, Barack Obama. So I don't know if that whole Andy's story I find so interesting because, and I know it relates to your work with Project Looking Glass as well, because he's one of these people that really look. If this guy did make it up, it is one of the most well told, well mapped out stories, all the way from Agnew and Los Alamos Labs to today. You could really see there's like a lot of
Colgate's,
his
right?
piece.
Colgate's and all those names, right?
Yes, it really fills in a lot of gaps. I mean, there's no one quite. His testimony is one of the most compelling, and to me, just hard to explain away. I mean, what do you think about his experiences on Mars and what you found out?
Well, he was one of the first people that we interviewed, and I was going to spend a couple of days. He was going to rent kind of a beach house in Washington, and we were going to stay there and just sort of get into it. And
Yeah,
somehow that never panned out, and I ended up staying somewhere else. But that led me on another impact. Like that was where I met other people. I met Tanya, for example, because of that. So nothing's an accident. But he was talking about a laptop that he had, a special laptop which had evidence that he wanted to share, and he didn't have it for the interview. And so I spent like I interviewed him for, I think we spent two or maybe even 2.5 days together, almost 3 days. And I really found his Project Pegasus story about the jump rooms between New Jersey and New Mexico very compelling.
yes,
And we, and after the interview, I convinced Tanya to produce and work with me because I didn't have a producer. So I convinced her to come on board, and I talked her into jumping into my rental car and driving through the Four Corners to visit all of these locations because I wanted to put everything in the film. Most of the things in the film, unless I really went out on a limb, which I tell you it is, I wanted to be able to verify it because so much information is just told, right? And it's like the person tells you that, and okay, sounds great, love it, love the story, but I wanted to really have something I could get my hands on. So what happened with Andrew was he told us all those stories about the jump booms to Mars, and I went to the location of where he said this building was in El Segundo, Los Angeles, and that near the airport, right? And I had
yeah.
a very strange experience there. We got busted by some strange Pinkerton security dude on a bicycle in an empty parking lot while we were filming at that location, right? And I was,
Wow.
if the door would have been open, we would have been in that building, but it was locked, and I was running around with the camera trying to get shots, and then they nailed us. And they said, you either delete all the footage right now, or we're going to have you sit down with the security people. And I had some line producer with me. He was, I think, 21 or something. He was just kid at film school, and I convinced him to come along with me. So he was like, just about going in his pants because he was so afraid of what was
Yes.
going on. So so in a sense, I didn't want us to be sitting in some weird. I had these weird images of sitting with some dark people in a shady room and never reemerging. So I decided to comply with us, deleting the data. But fortunately, when you take footage, and I'll get to the Andrew story back. This is just a little side venture, but when you take footage on digital cameras, there's always a keyframe, and that's like the first frame of the
Mm,
footage. And I was working with a DSLR camera, which is a photo camera as well as a video camera, and it was so new at that point, this idea of filming with DSLRs, that the guy, I just said I was taking pictures scouting for a location to shoot a rock video with my buddy here from Austria, and he looked the part. He had long hair, he looked like a rock star. So I said, we're
Totally.
looking for a shot location for a video. This looks awesome, and then so I unfortunately had to delete a bunch of footage, but the one footage that I didn't have to delete made it to the film, and that was where he busted us. And fortunately, the first shot of that picture was a tree. And I told him that we were
Oh,
shooting in West Hollywood, so I still had trees and vegetation on the camera. So he bought it. So I saved that footage, and that was kind of this classic footage in the film where we get busted. But yes, I then after that, got with Tonya, and we went around the four corners and we visited all the locations that Andrew was talking about with the jump room from New Jersey as a child, as a 12-year-old, 11-year-old child. He was part of a group of people that did these jumps and then spent 3 or 4 months the summer in New Mexico and then jumped back in time. So it looked like he'd been gone in an afternoon. And
yes.
his father was involved in that project as well as a bunch of others. And there was this place they landed, Pikes Peak, and we drove there, and it was very eerie, man. We made it just before the light was going, and we captured these really unusual large satellite type dishes, and it's definitely seemed like much more infrastructure than was necessary. And so we captured that, and we went to a lot of these other places, like this school where they would debrief them, and that school still existed. It wasn't easy to find because they'd remodeled it, and since all this time had passed, it had become someone's workshop house kind of thing. But we snuck up and we took all these pictures and we went to these locations. And so everything that Andrew said with respect to his situation from New Jersey, and even the elevators to Mars theoretically in El Segundo, checked out with his story. So I decided to focus on that story more than what he saw on the surface of Mars, because I still was, I had other people that were talking about having been on the surface of Mars.
Yeah.
And so I figured his story was stronger for me at that point in my in pursuing this story. Andrew's story was a story about the jump rooms from New Jersey with Project Pegasus, tying into the chronovisor, which was another aspect I could verify, and the Tesla technology, the teleportation technology Tesla was working on, made a lot of sense. And so that's the focus that we put on in Packing for Mars for Andrew's story.
Wow. Okay, now these are a lot of great gaps that are getting filled in here, and this is why I'm so happy I've had you on, because I'm glad that somebody actually took the time to do this stuff. You were out in the field actually examining his story and seeing
Yeah.
things line up, which to me is so well, hey, maybe it's
I'll add one more detail about his story, is that when we were in Lamy, New Mexico, he was talking about this place that they went to, and we found it. And we found out about a property where they had, where Rumsfeld, in his story, talks about how the chronovisor, they had developed it so there were these bubbles, these time bubbles that these children would enter into, that was located at this old school that had burned down in Lamy, New Mexico. And we found the actual property, and we found that this actually had burned down. And we jumped the fence and we're walking around filming and stuff. Probably weren't supposed to do that, right? But afterward, we hooked up with some neighbors, and the neighbors told us, they asked us, like, we said we'd heard about this property, and they're like, oh yeah, what did you hear? And then we said, well, we heard about it being a place where they were doing jumps in time. And one neighbor just, he opened up and he told us all about how this kid had come to their property, not a kid, he was now an adult, but he'd come to their property a few years earlier. And he told them the story about how he had involved with these jumps in time to New Jersey. And his name wasn't Andrew Bishago. So
whoa.
that was like, okay, bingo, that was like, okay, that was it. We had confirmation independently from Andrew that actually there were kids in this program, and they'd come into that property and they hooked up with them and talked to them. And we have them on camera. I set the camera up and ran it covertly while they told us all these stories. And afterward, I asked them if I could have their permission to put it in the film, and they gave it to me. So that's why we have this weird angle. You'll see some unusual angles in that film because I learned I practiced a technique where I've got the camera running covertly and I'm interviewing people, just to see if I could guess, because I like the real unscripted, undocumented reality. I didn't want to have someone,
Yes.
those films where, or those scenes where someone puts they didn't, obviously they rang on the doorbell, they put the camera on the house, and then they go outside, and then they pretend they're ringing on the doorbell, and then you see the
Yes.
angle. This is all fake. I didn't want to fake it. I wanted it to be real. So Packing for Mars is a real road film with no staging. It's completely on the fly. Go for it. Let's see what we can get, what kind of stories we can come up with to verify these stories. So that's why Andrew's story ended up being the one, about these jump rooms from New Jersey.
That's so compelling. And let me ask you, a very high level question here before we get into Project Looking Glass, and I want to know more about your evidence for the chronovisor and time travel and stuff like that. And I've seen you present some stuff in presentations, but curious if there's some other things that in the field that you saw that can even paint this more fully for people. Um, Mars, jump rooms, secret projects, even Majestic 12 to a certain extent. Why, a lot of the skepticism around this is it makes no sense that there's no documentation, that the government could be that good, that these organizations are that good at hiding these things, that people could still go to Mars and jump rooms. I mean, why is it okay, I guess there's two pieces of this. We know the US government is very incompetent at a lot of things, but then we're also supposed to philosophically believe that there is a group of people that are great at hiding and getting rid of information in a profound way. Though, I guess not enough with Hunter Biden's laptop. They can let that stuff slip through. I guess my question is, what are the difference between the factions that are good at getting rid of information and aren't? And the bigger question being, why isn't there, how have they been so good at hiding these secret programs for so long? How can you explain that in a way that actually makes sense to people?
Well, the first thing I guess you need to understand is that the government that you think is the government, that how would they hide it if they're so incompetent, is not this group of people.
Mm,
This group of people supersedes the government. That's one of the kind of the first things you have to accept. It's called, as Richard Dolan coined a term called the breakaway civilization, and he's in Packing for Mars too, by the way. And he approached it from a historical perspective. Like, he was a historian who ran into he was walking past a bookstore one day, and it said, the absolute proof of UFOs, and he's like, come on, is this real? Like, really? So he decided to dig into it from an academic perspective, and of course he found enough, more than enough, um missing pieces to confirm that, in this sense, the missing pieces are showing us that there's something not being told here. There's something being hidden from us. Because you can't deny that what is going on around us. We look in the skies, you see these things. They're mysterious things
oh
that
yeah.
appear. That there's, in the meantime, thousands of witnesses that have them on camera, that have recordings of them, that have encountered them, and have testimony under hypnosis that checks out, that there is obviously some other level of, group of people out there, which has nothing to do with government. And I remember, when I was approached, another one of those people that approached us after we released the film, he was telling us his experience of having worked at Edwards Air Force Base, in top secret level, not above top secret, but in top secret. And he got into some serious trouble. And as a result of him getting into trouble, he ended up getting in, talking to, Buzz Aldrin about what he had seen on the surface of the moon, which, by fluke, because he came to the Air Force Base. He was the honorary leader of that particular Air Force Base, and having just, because he was the first, man on, or the second man on moon, he was giving a talk there. And so after this talk was over, this particular person had a chance to sit and talk with him about it, and essentially he said to him, there was so much stuff on the surface that we couldn't point the camera in any direction without getting into trouble. And so
Wow.
they had to do a lot of smudging of and changing and doctoring of footage before they could release it to the public. And this, of course, then later, many years later, it checks out with Ken Johnson's story where he calls them the professional strippers, that he walked inadvertently into a room in the facilities at NASA where a bunch of people were bending over negatives, changing stuff, and he asked them what they were doing, and they said, we're the professional strippers, they called themselves, as a tongue-in-cheek kind of way to describe it. So that was for him a wake-up call. And he has this whole story. Ken has this whole story about showing an Apollo 15 film in front of a bunch of high brass where you could see domes and a city on the backside of the moon. And then he checked that film back out again and went and got his brother, who was also beta tester in the Apollo program, and a few of their friends back the next day because he wanted to show them bombshell information. And when he checked the film back out and put it up there and screened it, that stuff was gone. Like they had really literally eliminated it in 24 hours or traded it out. So, this is sort of stuff that you hear about, which is, real stuff, that there has been censoring, there has been doctoring, and it makes it clear that there is that group of people, which you mentioned one of their names, Majestic 12. Majestic 12 was kind of like the first secret society of secret societies, you could say, because even the Masons and the Illuminati are under them. There were members of the Illuminati in that group of Majestic 12. There were people that were card-carrying Satanists alongside of people that believe in Christianity or that believe in God and want to serve the people of the world and not some nefarious being.
Yeah.
All in the same group. And Dan Burish, gave some amazing testimony about that group of people, which I show in A Tale of Two Timelines, because it gives you an idea of who was Majestic 12, because you have to talk about the breakaway civilization if you want to make it clear to people, that for them to understand why there would be an information stream outside of the mainstream, the one that we're used to. The one that we hear about is like you'll hear about some disclosure project that they're going to release again, and then they'll say, oh, we're having a committee, and then they'll come up, they'll do a report and they'll release it. We just had one like 2 years ago, remember?
Yes.
And what did they tell us? Yeah, there's something going on, we just don't know what it is.
Right.
It's like, awesome, guys, I could have told you that. Well, I could have done it for $5. You didn't have to spend millions on it. So yeah, this is just all of the smoke and mirrors group that are out there to just kind of keep that. And there's a lot of people that really do not want to believe in it. The Brookings report, which was from 1960, was commissioned by the members of Majestic. Why? Because they wanted to find out how civilization would respond if they knew there was extraterrestrial life on other planets in our solar system and elsewhere. And they came to the conclusion that the hardest hit members of society are going to be the upper educated ones, the physicists and the scientists, who are going to be, it's going to rock their world, so they realize everything they've been learning is kind of a joke. It's not real. There's another level of physics being practiced in the Black Ops projects that isn't being taught in the universities. So what you're learning in the universities is obsolete. In fact, the world that you and I are living in, for the most part, other than us pursuing this fringe material, is an ancient, like, it's past, it's over, it's like it's history. We're living in a fake old world that doesn't have to exist, because this technology out there does exist. And the person who was at Ed Force base, he was talking about having been given leave of absence because he was mentally at his limit, and they gave him time off to go to the UK, and he had one flight to catch to go to his hometown to pack his things, and the plane was about to leave the runway, and then suddenly it stopped, and this limousine comes racing up beside the airplane. The airplane stops, the limousine stops, the stairway comes out of the airplane, out of the limousine into the airplane walks none other than Henry Kissinger.
Oh,
And
wow.
here's my friend saying to me, I had my chance. Here I could talk. I got Henry Kissinger on the plane. Nobody else on the plane. I'm going to ask him. I'm going to ask him if I can ask him this question. And Kissinger obliged. He says, "Look, I'm going to tell you. You can ask one question, and I'm going to tell you the truth. But you just have to promise me that we never had this conversation." And this is why he's never gone public with the story. He's only kind of on the fringes snuck it out there. And we wanted to do a film and a book with him. And he's, if you're listening, man.
Henry Kissinger.
Yeah. But Kissinger told him this. He said, look, yes, those things on the moon and this technology, the UFOs, it's real. It's really out there. But the people need the Bible. They need a stable foundation for the society to exist, for everything to be running smoothly. So we can't tell them this information because it's just going to throw absolute wrenches in all the foundational aspects. We're talking educational, like I just told you, physics and stuff, obsolete. We're talking religion is going to be questioned. We're talking, there's going to be, it could, create mayhem. And, at the time that he told them this was 1976, I believe. Or so in that area, I could almost buy that argument. In fact, I could almost buy the argument Majestic 12 had a good cause to keep things secret, because at the time you got to remember 1947, where was America, right? And the mentality of the people. And here were these things flying around, crashing. They were taking hostages. They connected with the J-rods. They found the looking glass, right? All these things were happening, but they had to find out what they were dealing with. So in my mind, it's bona fide, it's justified to a certain degree to keep a level of secrecy while you're making sure, ascertaining that there isn't a danger to the global population, because these people have a job to keep us safe too. Safe from, germs, bio warfare, weapons attacks, whatever. So this is all bona fide. But at some point, and Richard Dolan talks about that too, that there's like the gap between where they left off, from where they found out the reality of extraterrestrials and the reality of looking glass technology and things like that, and where they are now. So many years have passed, that so many things have happened, that if people were now to find out they knew about this material and all this stuff in the middle took place, they would be angry now too, because they would realize we could have avoided all this stuff.
Yeah.
Particularly, one of the things are like, the whole idea of the Middle East and the war and the oil, the power base, the whole banking system is based on that oil cartel, right? Global central banking. Without oil, without the oil industry, they would never have been able to establish it. So we had all these wars, right? And millions of, people have lost their lives, hundreds of thousands of American soldiers needlessly lost their lives. So this gap between releasing the information and being truthful got too big. And now there's this huge ditch in the middle, and that's called disclosure. And everyone keeps waiting for that final official announcement where, Obongo gets in front of the microphone and says, okay, Lloyd, people, I have an announcement to make, right? But it ain't going to happen, I'm telling you, because they can't. Disclosure is already happening. Disclosure is happening through us and through people that are already bringing evidence out there. But it's just always somehow going to be only for those who are ready for it and waiting for it and want to get their hands on the information. That's just my opinion.
That's super fascinating. And it makes me wonder about why, how can anyone ever wrap their head around everything that's going on? I don't know if you ever can. I mean, you could spend most of your life going through, and there are people that do, that look at the Federal Reserve. I mean, this is kind of the G. Edward Griffins of the world. You could look at Jekyll Island and all these, the Bilderberg Group, and you sit there and you go, okay, there's this going on, and there's the profiteers and the secret societies on this level. But then if there's this majestic 12 that supersedes all of it, and there are these extraterrestrial and advanced technological levels of secrecy, I mean, bridging the gap between these, 13 royal bloodline families and what might even be going on that's beyond, 2005 YouTube 9/11 conspiracy comprehension. I mean, it is quite a jump. My question for you is, have you made sense of it? What do you think? What is your, at this point in Frank Jacobs' universe, where are you in terms of your understanding of what are the actual I guess yeah, Frank, do you know the answer of civilization? What exactly is
I
going
have it.
on
I
with
have
all of
it. I have it figured out, man. I have it figured out.
do you give it to us right now?
Well, you know, I
Yeah,
tell
no,
you,
I'm
I got a step further. I got a step further with when I dove into the Looking Glass project,
yes,
and
that's what we got to
because
go there.
well, you want to talk about that anyway. So the thing is, the Looking Glass project is really based on one main thing, and that is timelines. And you know, when I started to when I hit that, you know, Guardians of the Looking Glass material and put it up against the previous Looking Glass disclosure material from Burish and Bill Wood and Carey and you know, others that have put stuff out there. Bill Hamilton, you know, has put out a bunch of stuff before. There's been a history of that, but the main thing in it for me became evident because of the doctrine of convergent timeline paradox, which nobody was talking about. And at least not, they hadn't mined it to the point. Like I was trying to make sense of the Looking Glass Guardians messages because they were talking about two timelines, and one of them leading to an obviously heavily dystopian future, and another slightly possible one leading to this, you know, awakening of humanity we've all heard about from so many people in the New Age and awakened community and stuff like that. It's always about this. We're all going to wake up. It's on course. The Q situation, the plan, right? All these things. And
Yes,
but a lot of it was
yes,
so littered with disinformation and false information. It's that 80-20 truth thing. For me, what was interesting was the idea of pursuing these timelines and going into it and making that Tale of Two Timelines webinar made me mine a lot of all of the information, all again, and sources and information that most people never had looked into, including bringing in my ability because I was over here in another area of the world with German, you know, scientists and researchers that were giving me access to information that American people didn't have. So I was I was connecting a lot of dots. And so what it's come down to for me clearly is that there's a war on, there is a timeline war going on, and you can look at all of this information and through the lens of that timeline war, even the ETs, even the Greys, and all these, you know, these abduction scenarios, and you know, and the whole crash and grab, you know, and reverse engineer, you know, Area 51 chapter. It all makes sense, even going all the way back to, you know, right after the Second World War, and what basically the trajectory that we've taken since then is really based on this timeline war. And the more you dig into it, the more you realize that the evidence doesn't even have to be as far out and crazy as jump rooms to Mars. This information about what the Looking Glass Guardians brought out, for example, with, you know, gene editing technology that has been introduced to our society now, without a shadow of a doubt, it exists. And the thing is, people are making films, they're showing the stuff, they're complaining, they're saying, you know, there's all these issues with, you know, sovereignty, and you know, I don't want you penetrating my body, I should have the free will to do this and that. All these things are tying into that whole timeline thing, because on one timeline we end up basically forfeiting our sovereignty, and we become subjects of a digital technocracy, you know, a tyranny that is based on the power, the absolute maximum power of technology over civilization. And on the other timeline, which is the timeline we've never even realized yet, you know, we have the option of realizing the utopian natural biological human existence that we've been told about through the indigenous people. You know, in the Maya, they talk about the Hunab Ku and this window of time where people become enlightened and they get help from the cosmos through this Hunab Ku, this ray, right? So we look at the
yes.
data and I can show you that data is actually happening. We're actually getting what you could say a Hunab Ku hitting us right now. And it's not just any old, you know, chance, you know, cosmic rays or particles that are always out there. I mean, space is toxic. There's lots of this stuff out there. No, it just happens to be that right now, this period of time, Earth just happens to be sitting at a particular place in the galaxy where they are getting exposure to, levels of that kind of rays and particles like never before, and which happens to just coincide that by total coincidence in an area called Sagittarius A black hole at the center of our galaxy. This plasma planet is being sucked into the black hole, and all these particles are being shot out, and we're being hit with like things that are raising the temperature of all the planets in our solar system, for example. You want to talk about global warming? I'll give you another reason why we're having global warming, why
Yeah.
the planet's changing. It has nothing to do with CO2, believe me. But this just happens to be happening right now. And what are the qualities of those toxins, or if you want to call them that, or those rays or X-rays or particles that are hitting us? Well, the qualities are that somehow, through a weird miracle, our bodies have a biology which is able to resonate with particular frequencies that unlocks certain abilities that we have dormant within us, that would open up a new perception, a higher perception of consciousness, if you will. And that's just happening right now by total fluke. Okay. Well, I'm not going to say, I personally don't believe it's a total fluke, but for the atheist scientists out there who do not believe in the soul and they believe it's all just accidentally happening, well, it is too much of a coincidence for my taste to say that's just all accidental, because we do have this somehow legendary moment where we are supposed to make this leap in consciousness. So at some point, when you're in that material, you realize that alone the idea, I don't know if I think I was showing that part of the stuff I was showing in that little, mini presentation I did on Omar's
Yes.
thing, right? And I
The
showed
magic box.
those two
Yeah.
comparative timeline between like Earth 2.1 or 1.0 and Earth 2.0, like transhumanism versus humanism, right? Well,
Yes.
if you looked at that chart, there was just, some really basic things like, a flat hierarchy, not a pyramidal hierarchy, or a natural monetary system that isn't controlled by central bankers. And there's all these things that are in that timeline and the description of that timeline, which are anything but magic. They're just simple. If we realized those things and we got rid of that yoke of oppression, which has kept humanity enslaved through finances and through debt and through taxation and through interest and through burdening our society with a so-called, financial burden, like G. Edward Griffin, like you mentioned, talks about with Jekyll Island when that all came into play. If we got rid of that yoke right there and we allowed inventors that have already invented things like cars that run on water, or a Nikola Tesla, was in the middle of developing wireless transmission of electricity, which wasn't toxic. And all these little inventions, like Friedrich Lülling, a German inventor in 1954, developed a magnetic motor. He kicked it into motion and it would run perpetually, and he had building plans to outfit cars in an assembly line that could be set up and ready to run in 2 or 3 years. We would have a different world. So we don't even need all this crazy magic. I think alone, if we were to create a safe world for us to allow those technologies to finally emerge without suppression, and to kick out those banksters which are keeping us locked into a debt slave society, and we were to get rid of the pharmaceutical corporations who have nothing more, in my opinion, of an interest other than building future customers with what they're injecting into people right now, and replaced it with holistic medicine based on the Bovi energy, the photonic power of foods, the real natural vitamins, the non, the get rid of the pollution out of the food chain, get rid of the artificial fertilizers, and use things like permaculture on a local scale spread over a whole nation. We would have a utopian planet. I'm telling you, we don't need anything other than that, and then I'm telling you, Greg, all those other things would happen. We probably even get aliens come and land because they'd feel safe to come and land, because we wouldn't shoot them out of the skies.
Oh my gosh, you do have the answers. Wait a minute, this guy. Wow.
Yeah, I told you, right?
He figured it out. He figured it out. Wait a minute. This is okay.
It's actually
I
quite easy. It's quite easy.
well, tell me this. I mean, I need to know. I remember when the Guardians of the Looking Glass videos dropped. They were some on. I mean, they were on YouTube, and then they got to Rumble and some of these other alternative, video or media platforms online. I mean, here's my question for you. Um, well, actually, yeah. But before we begin, can you explain what those messages are and where you think or believe that the Guardians came from?
Well, the messages caught my interest because they were describing themselves as a group of ex-military men who had been working on top secret projects, and they, of course, had been working on the one they're talking about, Looking Glass. And they had a data set of what they had captured during their time in that project in the 1990s. And it's synced up because the way the Looking Glass works is, I might have a picture of it here. You can, it basically, if you look at that picture, oops, let me get rid of these little things in the way
Yes,
here.
and I'd seen this before in the
If you look
work
at
of
that, there's these cameras, right? You have these
yes.
cameras, right? And you have this plasma stuff in the middle. So, what we're talking about here is kind of passive technology. It's viewing technology. It's allowing you to view a time stream. And so what they were talking about was they had captured a data set, and the data set was obviously because they'd keyworded all of the footage that they had captured, and they were describing the technology in a way that no one had ever described it in detail. They were describing how it began to project uh, recognizable future events, and it would go for like 7-day loops 144 times until it repeated after 1008 days, so 2.76 years before the thing completed one complete cycle. And so once they established that there was a cyclical nature to it, then they knew what, they documented what events had happened on what dates and what areas, and they could jump with, keywording everything. They could jump to those events and see them anytime they wanted to. But what happened, I guess, at that point is that's where the paradoxes come in, is they realized, hey, well, if we know that such and such is going to happen, what if we, go in now here and we intervene and then, we prevent that from happening, or we alter that outcome? Then we'd actually be able to go and look to see if it had changed because we've already now keyworded everything. And so you had this emergence of all these different versions of timelines. And Burrish talks about them. I think the last one that he was familiar was called T1V83. So they basically they tried to get in, but whatever they did, it always worked out. And this is what the Looking Glass Guardians were telling us, in the favor of the deep state. They could see that in whatever they did, at some point it was pointless to intervene because it always worked out in their favor. Unfortunately, there were 3 years where there was a slight opportunity or chance for a new timeline to break out. One of them was 2012, one of them was 2016, and the final one was 2022. And so they had seen, that these dates, the previous dates, 12 and 16, had come and passed. And they were expecting that those who are involved in the project would make an announcement about it, because this new timeline emerged after there was a truth release, like a truth bomb that was released in society. And that led to a new timeline that by the year 2030, and this is where the story continues, is, in version negative timeline, the truth doesn't come out, and the cabal maintains their guard over the timeline and makes sure that nothing interferes with it. They're not actively trying to change it. They're trying to prevent anyone from trying to change it. If you understand what I'm saying here. So, and then 2030 comes and there's a cosmic event. And this cosmic event is something that, I thought was interesting because we had done a film called Solar Revolution. It's the only film of its kind that's been made since then, even that was 2012, that documented this idea of a flash and what kind of a effect it would have on human consciousness. It was written by a biophysicist who understood the pineal gland, and we approached it from a multidisciplinary scientific angle to give us a real, as close as you could get your hands on scientific explanation of the flash and how it would push us and propel humanity into a higher state of quantum evolution. And so here they were talking about this flash coming in 2030, but they were saying because of their absolute control over the timeline, they were able to interject and implant a genetically altering substance into the bodies of the majority of people on the planet. so that when this flash happened, the genetics which they had ingrained in us humans, which would take that flash and translate it into this higher state of consciousness, would in fact be detrimental to us, and we would be shut down. And it
Oh
all made
gosh.
sense to me because I had all this science behind it, right? That about this flash and what was going on, right? We know what's going on right now. What happened last year and the year before, right? The introduction of new technologies and the jab. And what were those technologies? But they were called mRNA technologies, messenger RNA technologies. Messenger RNAs are simply a process your cell has to read the DNA and rebuild new cells. So they created mutant messenger RNA code, and they show us on their own websites how they use hydrogel to sneak as a Trojan horse, to sneak past your body's defenses and enter into your cells as a Trojan horse and change the genetic code. Why? Well, because there's this pandemic out there, right? So you either believe that, and you superimpose this scenario of the Looking Glass Guardians and the Looking Glass technology and all of this previous information on top of it, and you realize that something very nefarious could be happening here that is actually intended to make sure that only a limited amount of people make that transition. And we've been hearing from for years about how we're overpopulated. We've got there's all this climate change is created by our overpopulation and by our expulsion of CO2 and all these things that people who are not scientifically gifted would accept, because who's telling them that? Well, these so-called experts who are even supposedly scientists, right? And another thing you learn in the course of digging into this alternative world is you learn that there's the science that they tell you what you want to hear for the certain price tag, and then there's the real science. I am certainly a believer in the real science, but I also know that there's a science out there which has nothing to do with reality, which has everything to do with politics and manipulating and steering society and narratives in a certain preferred direction. And the preferred direction is the direction which just happens to be the one promoted right now by people like Bill Gates and Yuval Harari and Klaus Schwab and the people in Europe at the EU Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, all these people, they're pushing us on that narrative. And I know that there is another narrative out there, but another thing we've experienced this last couple of years is that there is only one legally allowed narrative, and all other narratives out there have been shut down, which is our biggest problem. In terms of how do we get the truth out there if the truth is forbidden?
Yeah.
Or at least, even if it's just forbidden, to put up an argument and say, whoa, wait a minute. You said this, okay, but we can put equal, qualified experts against you, and they can tell you that what you're talking about is full of shit. So, which one, so we have to give our population the choice between you and you. You can believe in that if you want to. I mean, there's lots of people that have been taking vaccinations for decades. I know lots of them, right? Every year they get their flu shot. I don't happen to be one of them, but there are people out there who believe in that, and it's their right to do that. Why should I take that away from them? If they feel safe and they want to take those, jabs and do it, let them do it. But when someone comes in now, we've entered new terrain where we've not only entered terrain where it's mandatory for us all to get those jabs if we want to have the normal freedoms that we're supposed to be given to from our creator, then we have to comply. And if we don't, then we have problems. And that's where we've now crossed a new line. So the Looking Glass material continues along that line of explaining to us events that are going to start happening, which are generally false flag events between now and 2030, that further entrench and solidify the outcome in favor of those who promote the negative timeline. And those who want the truth out there, and those who want the organic timeline to evolve, are facing huge obstacles. And they even give us a mathematical formula. They say that the odds of the negative timeline succeeding are 96.4% or something like that. And obviously the remainder percentage is the odds of success of the organic biological timeline. So it sucks. But look, it's not impossible. Things can change very, very quickly. All it has to happen is one major player look like Elon Musk, whether you love him or hate him, what he's done simply by having invested all that money in Twitter and opening a whole a Pandora's box of communications that showed us that there was a certain, you know, there was a deliberate agenda being managed by groups of people going all the way up to the White House to steer that narrative, and it confirms everything that the Looking Glass Guardians told us about in those videos. So they were to be taken seriously, in my opinion. And you know, regardless of whether they were real or fraud or whatever, at some point, once I dug into the whole J-Rod thing and the Looking Glass material that led up to them, I can show you the way I connected the dots in a tale of two timelines, that it doesn't even matter at this point who's real and who isn't. The fact is, these timeline wars are happening, and I can show you evidence of it in the world out there, the historical perspective right now. Hence, also one of the reasons of digging into real history, going back to the Second World War and leading up to where we are now.
Yeah, I mean, and look, I'm not, here necessarily to have you go into, you really go in depth. You have a three-part video on demand webinar that we'll link to at cyberhive.tv, a tale of two timelines. And you've gone into some of this material before. I mean, it's when I've seen the science, it is very fascinating. I guess I was going to say, you know what? Well, okay, a lot of different questions here. You give me so much, Frank. You give me a lot of different paths we can. Oh my god, so many timelines we could go down. Okay, so look, let me pursue this route with you. Um, these videos from the Guardians. Very simple question. Maybe I'm being, maybe I'm not really asking the right question here, but I'll ask it anyways. Do we know anything about the IP address of where these videos come from? Have you seen anything that makes you go, I know what group actually did post this. I know where it came out of. And this is why we should be taking what these guys are saying seriously.
Well, there was very little information given. Obviously, I wrote them to their email address, and they responded to me in the very early days
Hmm.
when this whole thing, before I even wrote the article that led to John Nolan pulling me on to Inspire, that led to this explosion of dialogue. Um, and then, you know, I think after the April, there was certain events that were, and there was an event on April 18th was supposed to be a bomb detonation in Times
Yes.
Square. And the fact that we had millions of people talking about it was the point. That's another detail about the Looking Glass Guardian's message that's important to note, is that they couldn't change the timelines by directly attacking, the other side, because the other side had a set of data and they could see it coming. So the only way to try to change it is to open source the data and get as many people talking about it as possible. So the very early videos, it was not traceable, at least not to my knowledge. Later on, I think they after the April event happened, things started to go kind of wonky. And there's theories about them having been hijacked by another group of people that began putting kind of nonsensical messages out there.
Mm.
And I at that point, there was even a point where you could identify the poster of one of their videos from Montreal, Canada,
Hmm.
of all places. And then I've had people, there was a crypto thing involved in one of the videos that took a few people got involved, and I guess they lost money. That gave it a bad footing. And I've had people both show me data that confirms that there really were plans for this particular guy. They called him Dr. Wu. I don't even think it's his real name, but he was this quantum scientist. He was trying to mine crypto and create kind of a windfall in crypto, and then fund people to go into the real world and take on the political system with a lot of backing, financial backing, and financial backing for technologies and other kinds of. It was a great, premises. The premise was awesome. If you looked at his wish list of what he was trying to achieve, it was everything that we want. Everything was right. All the language was perfect, correct. Everything was correct. I mean, whether they were phonies or not, at least they were phonies with the right intentions. But then
Yeah.
then there were people that were telling me, no, they have proof that they're fraud. And I keep saying, okay, and I was like, okay, let's see it. And then we looked at it, and I was like, I didn't see enough there to prove it definitively one way or the other. So, and then along comes another group of people called We Are Sovereigns, who are connected apparently, who are brought through the messages of the Looking Glass Guardians that are talking about white hats working on a new kind of encrypted banking system with classification according to, ranking of people into certain categories, which would be identifying them as being dangerous, in other words, quarantinable, restricted, regular common people, harmless, just living their lives that are not a problem, and then a sovereign class, which is free from any limitation. And they began dumping these data, and all of their stuff it had a real core of reality to it. I mean, it was, really, it was like, Greg, you could look at it and say, again, if they're a fraud, their message is the right message. So, was it soft disclosure on those on the dark side saying, let's put the truth out and see if anyone bites, or let's see if there's anybody still got a pulse out there for a resistance movement, or they really are real? At this point, for me, it's almost irrelevant, because again, I found so many sync points. This banking system, this digital currency banking system, central banking digital currency, is being planned right now. There's pilot programs running in the United States, in New York right now, for example.
Yeah.
And they're running those projects to try and introduce a digital currency. And the diabolical thing about a digital currency is the idea that it's programmable. And once they succeed in convincing us that we need a digital currency to solve whatever financial crisis they're in the middle of creating for us, because if you've studied G. Edward Griffin's material, they like to create crises, and they like to feed this monetary system with money and then withdraw the money, and they play with inflation rates and
Exactly.
monetary flow to keep us in constantly, in crisis. And they manufacture society that way. This is how they do it. And now they have an opportunity with digital currency to do the perfect ultimate control, which is to, with cash, they could still not 100%. They could control the amount of cash in circulation, but they couldn't control who is using it for what backdoor private deals or anonymous purchases that they're making out there. And then, through the idea of inducing crime, most of it's drug related and terrorist related. As we know now, looking back retrospectively through the lens of 2020 hindsight, we can see that the Contras were funded by rogue elements within the CIA to create drug problems in America. And we can see that the whole terrorist thing, which they sold to us under the guise of, there's this guy, Saddam, who's got weapons of mass destruction all over Iraq, which then turned out to be an absolute fabrication. We can see that they fabricate these crises to keep us guessing and keep us enslaved to this idea of there's crime out there, we have to do something about it. And digital currency just happens to be the one way we can absolutely end crime all times, because why? Because every transaction is trackable, everyone is traceable. And if we're dumb enough to believe the narrative of terrorism and drug abuse that is, on a natural scale, then we will accept this currency, and we will, once and for all, we will lose that final bit of anonymity that we still have, and that is to use, financial transactions amongst each other without anyone having any kind of oversight on those transactions. And so that was another aspect of the Looking Glass Guardians on the tail end that was brought in by a group that themselves, made mistakes. I felt in the very early days when they put out their idea of converting people to sovereigns, I wrote a public letter to them on their Telegram or wherever the channel was, and I said, guys, don't do this. This is a mistake. Don't do it. And I gave them the reasons why it was a mistake. And they didn't want to hear that, of course. And so, John Nolan and I began, we were following the story on Inspired. And when this story went in that direction, we kind of saw a recurrence of the potential of this, previous dark aspect of the crypto being used to rip people off, whether it was done intentionally or whether it was because the deep state took over that project in the nick of time. We didn't feel this was a very healthy way to go down, and we extended an olive branch and said, anytime you want to bring more intel out about what you're doing, we will guarantee you an uncensored platform. And since then, they've been bombarded, they say, by agents and misinformation and people posing as them. And they're in their own little chaos bubble right now. So trying to work, their idea of how to change or to prevent that system from coming into the world. And I have a different position. My position is we can't even let it get into the world. We have to be talking about this information. We have to be talking about programmable digital currency now, because it's not even a conspiracy theory. You can go to a regular, straight, normie person, anyone in your family who doesn't even believe in conspiracies, and you can show them scary facts about what digital currency is all about and what it really means. And
Yeah.
they will wake up. They will, hopefully, unless they want it. I mean, let's face it, some people may actually think it's cool. But I think
Yeah.
what's scary is that when you aren't making an informed decision, when your decision's being made based on not being informed, on being surprised and following the narrative of the government, just like we know that's happened in the last couple of years. People fell into the need to follow the narrative that was obviously already simulated for them over the course of the last 10 years leading up to event 201. And then coincidentally 1 month later, the exact scenario they were practicing for in their simulation happens to come into the world. So the same thing
Right.
is what they're planning with digital currency. So digital currency is something we can talk to everybody about, and digital currency will lead to the absolute manifestation of timeline, the negative timeline. That's where I wanted to go.
Oh, whoa, whoa. This is, I mean, it's pretty scary, especially when people are selling crypto as this, this is the thing that's supposed to be for the man, right? Or
Right.
fighting against the man. This is a decentralized thing now, of course.
Someone gave me a good term for crypto. They called Bitcoin the ledger of truth. I love that, right? And it probably is if it was legal, because believe me, when they bring in their own digital currency, they're not going to allow, they might allow a certain amount of cryptos to exist parallel for a certain amount of time, because let's face it, the Hunter Bidens out there, they still want to have their slush fund, you
Right.
know? But, right now there's too many corrupt politicians for them to take that digital currency system online immediately. So they'll do it in stages. And Bitcoin and these other cryptocurrencies will exist parallel, but at some point, believe me, the bankers don't like the idea. When have you ever seen another form of currency in a country allowed to flourish parallel to the authorized legal monetary system? Can you name me an example?
Yeah, no, it's
You can't.
definitely not a
You can't.
thing.
Even if they were in New York, there's been some mini experiments where they had like the Elmira dollar and things like that, where you could, in the local area, you could use dollars for, to buy in certain stores, but this is like insignificant. We're talking about actually a bona fide currency used where people are exchanging billions, amongst each other, and it's not being seen or traceable by those in power of the monetary system. They're not going to allow that. So at some point, no matter how great crypto and Bitcoin is, and I totally agree, and I think it is probably one of the ways of a solution, if we didn't have this encroaching CBDC thing of programmable digital currency coming down on us right now, like you know, whatever you want to call it, just what's thundering down on us very, very quickly because it's tied into transhumanism.
Oh boy. Yeah, yeah, okay. And again, I know we don't have time to get into all of this here, but
Well, we can do another show.
yeah, I mean, transhuman, that's a whole
I talked
nother.
for 3 hours 2 Fridays ago. I mean, I was going to do a 1.5 hour presentation. And
I
I put up a bunch of slides figuring, that should be about a half an hour and a half. And then it was like at 2 hours 30 minutes, I'm like, oh damn, I've still got 10 slides to go, right? So yeah, it's like,
I was gonna say, I mean, do you time block your day for research, filming, and then editing? I mean, how do you have enough time to sift through this information and then create a well-crafted cinematic experience?
well, I have I do set aside blocks of time where I dig into a particular area of intel that I need to mine information from. Um, but I also have about, I guess at least 25, 30 years of pre run up to where I am now, where I actually did research currencies and how they work, and I did research nutrition, for example, and natural foods, and and metaphysics and spirituality and things like that for many, many years. So I have I guess an archive in my brain of knowledge that I've got to tap anytime. And so when I find new information out there, it doesn't take me that much time to kind of that fits here. And plus I've saved, data, and I've stored data, and I can call up things, and I can put together some information that's pretty interesting pretty quickly. And at the same time, it depends on the priorities. If somebody's hired me to create like I created some films for the Olympic channel before the World Soccer Championships, to create portraits, and they paid me a wad of money and said, we need these done. So I had to obviously set aside my, fringe world and get into the straight and, organized normal world and do these films for people. But my brain is still working in the background, and at night I'm still concocting my crazy scenarios and theories. Sometimes I wake up and I go like, that's it. I just solved the problem, even though I didn't know I was trying to solve a problem.
Yeah, no,
But we
totally.
can, I'm just telling you, we can all tap into these extra abilities. We have them. We all have the ability for telepathy. We all have the ability to, to have an extended consciousness into finer, subtler dimensions of reality, because we're not just encaged within 3 dimensions. We actually can touch into other levels of consciousness, like Burkhardt's time, like we described in Solar Revolution, which I recommend you watch, because you'll get into that 12-dimensional version of reality explained very nicely.
Oh my gosh, yeah, I'm just gonna like binge through your stuff. I mean, I really have to. This is so good. And then I'll know I'll have more questions, and then you'll have all the answers again. And, yeah, no, it's very good. I mean, cyberhivetv.com is where you can see a lot of this stuff. Okay. You know what? Look, I do have to know before you go. Um, some more of the corroborating evidence that this Project Looking Glass thing is even real. I mean, it's been talked about in, well, first of all, QAnon. In the Q post, there was a looking glass reference. But then, when I got into David Wilcock for a little bit there, his stuff, he talks about it, and then, cosmic disclosure and a lot of other things. And then, it's connected. I know we've talked about this before, how it might be connected to Montauk, and even going back to Pegasus and the chronovisor from Father Ernetti. I mean, what is some of the tangible stuff that is out there that absolutely supports that there is a Project Looking Glass and time travel technology in general?
Well, we've heard hints of it through, well, first of all, we have we have hours of interview testimony of Dan Burish describing his interaction with the J-Rod, which which is fascinating, which also we go into in the Tale of Two Timelines webinar. But it was as a result of that communication between him and this J-Rod that we found out about this looking glass technology. I mean, he found out through his communication, telepathic communication, that the J-Rods were the ones that told humanity about this looking glass technology. And if you like, there's every now and then, like for example, Bob Lazar is another interesting character, right? Who had a stint at Area 51. And, his was, he was reverse engineering some of these craft. And he was talking about it. I think it was a certain element, 128 or something like that. And he was interviewed also in another relative subject matter. And offhandedly, he confirmed that he had seen in briefing documents mentioning of Project Looking Glass. And, every now and then someone kind of like surfaces and just sort of leaks out something that mentions that, their brother was in the military and they were at, Area 51, and they were brought down to a particular area, and they looked over to the right and they saw this weird device. And then, months later, they happened to come across something about Project Looking Glass, and they identified the exact same device. So there's that kind of corroborating stuff out there. But of course, I
Yeah.
haven't been to Area 51. I haven't been into the actual, I haven't seen it. But they tell us that, for example, how it works has to do with putting the technology in the proximity of what they call stargates, which are naturally occurring vortal points on the planet. And I've
Right.
had people tell me their experience of being inside of underground caves in the Middle East, where people, and I have good reason to believe this, absolutely credible, that certain people were in underground caves in the Middle East where they walked into chambers and looked up and they saw a different star constellation and other planets underground. Okay, which verifies for me nothing other than the fact that there are such portals. These stargates do in fact exist. And so, these are all things that kind of, you can, like I was telling you, if you can't actually have a device that I can say, hey, check this out, Greg, here, look at, I can show you, like, from several angles, that something like this could very well exist through testimony, through other forms of physical evidence, and through interesting, physics laws, like future physics laws, if you want to call it that. That's I think that's one. And then you come up with a story like the Looking Glass Guardians, and they tie it into the whole global agenda with war and vaccination programs and this cosmic event, which is another thing that I can show you is on schedule. There is such a cosmic event. Not only did we talk about it in Solar Revolution, but there's a whole science of cataclysm that has gone lost because of Charles Hapgood, one of the main leading scientists who was a double agent for the CIA, publishing a version of it that is fake and was easily debunked. And it took that whole idea of cataclysm science off the radar of people, where if they would have been looking at it, they would have been able to tell us, yes, we should be preparing for this. And so
Yeah.
that ties into so there's all these different angles that just make sense. So I've got every, and then you've got CERN. We didn't even
Well,
talk about that.
that's
I
the
mean,
whole
so it's
other
like,
one.
got another aspect of it. You've got people at CERN that are the CEOs, Bertolucci, saying, we've opened a portal to other dimensions that can bring something through, and we can send something through.
He's actually said that.
He actually said that. I can show you a quote. And in fact, I have papers, like magazines, science magazines, published in the in the early 2000s from Russian scientists who had rented the facility and done research there that were saying it's a time machine.
Oh, wow, that's interesting. That,
These are mainstream science magazines. These aren't fringe magazines. These are real published papers talking about it. And now they're talking about, opening up to other dimensions. And if you look at another aspect of it, is the D wave, the quantum computers, also in the webinar with Jordy Rose, talking about what does a D wave do? What does a quantum computer really do? Well, it actually pipes through to parallel dimensions to solve problems between dimensions. How do they do that? Well, and guess what? The D-Wave computer just happens to be sitting, in fact, a couple of them at least, where? At CERN, right? So they invented the internet,
yeah.
by the way, at CERN. The internet was invented there. And, if you look at the name of the projects of CERN, like their names, like the Awake Project or Apollo or even Lucifer. I mean, they have, like, it's just uncanny that they just happen to have names of their projects which symbolize opening abysses and portals to hell or other dimensions and bringing through demonic energies. Even Stephen Hawking said that. So it's like this stuff is all out there, Greg. It's all like pointing us in the direction that it is real. And at
Yeah.
the very least, what does it harm us to talk about timelines and making a better world for us, right?
That's a good point. That's a good point. Yeah. Well, look, I wait a minute. You ever see that article? There was that article from Wired that was China vehemently denying that they have a time machine in their possession, and all the
Well,
there were
that's ridiculous. You know why, Greg? They're building a hadron collider, which is even going to be 40 times as powerful as the one at CERN right now.
holy moly. And I
So,
know,
and I know
yeah.
for a fact that Russian scientists were already saying that it was a time machine, that if you had enough voltage, if you had enough power, then you could create these portals where even extraterrestrial civilizations could come through. These are actually their quotes. I'm telling you, this stuff is like, this is what they said. These are normal scientists. And we also know scientists who are either working or were working in the project, or had previously worked in the projects and now are no longer alive after they came forward and said CERN is a laboratory for mind control. So, all these things add up to what? That there is definitely some hardcore stuff going on by an elite group of people, which we are not privy to.
Yeah. I mean, and look, someone put this example up today on social media, but I didn't realize that the host of The Price is Right, Bob Barker, is still alive.
Really?
But a lot of people thought he passed away a couple years ago. And it's just another one of those Mandela
Mandela.
effect moments where it's,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah. If you're listening right now and your mind got blown by that, my mind did. He's 99 years old, I believe, today that we're recording. But my gosh, what is the Mandela keeps coming up more and more and more? No, I've heard it's just people messing around and just trying to, maybe drop Easter eggs that there's something going on. But it's related to all this stuff going on with CERN and Looking Glass, isn't it?
Yes, I would say it's a very good hypothesis to work from.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay, look, final question before we let you go. You're a filmmaker. You talked about that there was some stuff on the moon that they covered up, but Stanley Kubrick, was he involved with filming the moon landing at all? What's your take?
My take on that is that he was brought in to film the plan B, because if they had problems transmitting something from the surface of the moon, they would have footage because they do this notoriously. There's always a plan B. I mean, I've done it as an artist. Okay. I was a VJ for a few years and I was working with on the fly live mixing digital technology where my computer at any moment could freeze up. And I had like, if I had an audience of 2,000 people below that are digging it and getting into it, and all of a sudden the picture freezes, well, it's only natural for me to have filmed my performance so that in the case that that happens, I pull a switch and the show carries on. So that's one of the angles on the Kubrick thing. And the other is that they, like what I was telling about earlier, that they had so much archaeological footage in view of their cameras that they couldn't show it. So they needed to show something. So I do absolutely believe that those, I mean, we show them in Packing from Mars. We show some of those outtakes. They're kind of interesting, that they actually shot stuff. They actually created crater maps of the moon in the Arizona desert that match exactly, and they filmed from above and they brought in TV trucks and they had the astronauts looking like they were on the moon in the middle of the desert. I absolutely do believe they do this kind of stuff, but it doesn't always necessarily mean that they never went to the moon. I think they went to the moon a lot earlier, but again, that's like something that we had Lucas Gantamburdo talk about with Project Taurus, and what was going on with Apollo is maybe a total different twist to the story about why they would fake the moon landings. It had to do more with Mars. That's why it's in Packing from Mars. So I encourage you to check that out, and you'll get into that material.
Yes. Well,
They left
everybody.
us clues too. They left us little breadcrumbs of their story that they couldn't tell.
Oh, what? What? Okay, you've given me so much here to chew on and want to dig into more, which is all I can really ask for. Everybody check out Frank Jacob. You've got a website, cyberhive.tv, as well as YouTube. Yeah, there's just so much there. Yeah, you keep making these films. You keep, I mean, what do you want to know the answers to still? Do you have a question out there? If you got Henry Kissinger sitting down and you were to ask him something, what would the Frank Jacob question be that might resolve a big gap in your knowledge right now? What do you want?
I'd like to go into the inner Earth,
Oh,
at least to
yeah.
visit. At least to visit. I'd like to know about the supposed entry from the North or South Pole into the inner Earth. I'd like to know about that. That would be
Yes,
interesting. And there
Henry.
was a breakaway faction of the Germans that left before the end of the Second World War. I'd like to know that they exist. Really, I do believe they do, and I'd like to know what they found. So
Oh,
there's still
yeah.
some unsolved mysteries out there, Greg.
Oh, yeah. The Admiral
Even though
Byrd
certain authors believe they've already got the answers and they've already told us that that stuff is existing, I tend to doubt their premise because I can prove a lot of what they're saying is completely false.
Yeah, you know what?
It's
Oh, wait a minute. This is something you said once, that some of the intel on Montauk was, you kind of implied that it may have been a little bit of a disinformation campaign around some of the Montauk stuff. I mean, are you able to get into any bit of that at all? Like, what can we trust from Montauk and what can't we trust?
Yeah, Montauk, that's a whole other can of worms. But I do know that, Montauk, led to, I believe Montauk led to MK Ultra. And Montauk started in 1930 in the United States, so it wasn't like, we've been told another story that it was actually after the Second World War that all these nefarious scientists came over from Nazi Germany and blah, blah, blah. No, man, they pioneered that stuff right here in the good old United States. Or I mean, right over there in the good old United States. So, there's a lot of disinformation out there with respect to sending you on a trail that's leading to nowhere. So I think a lot of these things, it would be nice to kind of know, to actually get like real solid confirmation on Montauk, on Philadelphia, on all these, and on Tesla's, like on those papers that were taken by John Trump, right? Trump's uncle,
Yeah.
the Tesla material. I mean, I think we have a right to look into that archive to see really what took place and what part is real and what part is mythology. Because the human being, likes to make up crazy stories. They love stories. It was through oral tradition that our history was passed along for many, many centuries until we learned how to write and printing presses and all those things came along. And then we began to interpret things. And, and then along comes all the ufology scene, which is impregnated with disinformation to a large degree, purposefully. And so, I'd like to know, really, I'm interested in finding out. I'm just into mining the truth. Like, I'm into separating the truth from the fiction,
Me
because I think
too.
we have a right to know, and that's all it's about. I don't know about great discoveries. There's so many amazing things. I'd be happy if we were allowed to develop free energy machines, because I know they exist. So I'd be happy if we could do that. That would be enough, because then we wouldn't have, we could make a one-time investment, probably some device you can buy like the hardware store, set it up in your home, and bingo, you limitless energy for the rest of your life. Cost you like $80, or 100, whatever, maybe $800. I don't know, but so what? One-time fee, done. No more
Yeah.
pollution, right? Wouldn't that be great, right? And hey, we're going to print our own money. Forget the central bank. We don't need them anymore. And we're going to have our own interest-free currency that we're going to distribute amongst the people based on value of output and value of goods. We don't even need a gold standard. I mean, even something like that, if we get that together, we'd have a lot of problems solved. And I'd be happy if we just managed that.
Yeah, I mean, Randall Carson just talked about this in the Joe Rogan interview he did with Graham Hancock, that he is involved in some, he's been in some lab somewhere where they've somehow, hijacked these Tesla, the old technology and the propulsion systems, and that if we can make an I mean, it's hard to know what actually, when people claim that they're sitting in a giant warehouse with anti-gravity devices, it's hard to know what's
Well, my
really what
saying
is
is
it.
always, by their fruits you shall know them.
Ah, okay. So then tell me, you know what, before we go, let me ask you a very controversial one. Corey Good, any thoughts? Are you allowed to talk about this guy at all? This deposition, secret space program claims that
I
it's intellectual
I don't
property.
Yeah, I can definitely prove that the majority of what he was saying about certain things is completely fabricated or false. So if his information is legit and it's tied into these tablets that these ETs know the truth about everything, then there would be no error. So he's either lying or he's deliberately misconstruing the truth, but both are equally bad as far as I'm concerned. I don't know about, and the other problem with him is he can't prove any of it. It's just his story. And a lot of the framework upon which they base their facts is very, very thin ice.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I'm sorry, I'm not a big fan. I'm not a
Yeah, no,
fan.
but
But everyone's got a right to exist. But I might come along one day and debunk it. I mean, I just might have to.
are there any telltale signs, in your opinion, that someone has been part of a secret space program versus a Corey Good figure?
Well, you probably wouldn't hear about them.
That's a good point. Have you had conversations with people that have had remarkable experiences that we'll
Yes, I have.
never hear about?
I have.
What? Where's that notebook? Where's that film? Have you
I
recorded
don't
it?
have it here. I don't have it on the premises here. It's too hot.
Oh my gosh, I know you do that secret recording thing, dude. I don't even know what if there's a camera in my place right now watching me. I mean, yeah, I know you like that. You should be recruited by the pickup artist industry. They need people to film their their conversations. I think you'd be good at that. No, look, Frank Jacob, you're a man of fascinating interest, and like, really, I love that somebody myself that comes from an artistic background, blending your passion for making incredibly captivating films and bringing this information out there is, look, it's risky. I mean, Graham Hancock did just get this thing on Netflix. Does that open the door for Packing for Mars appearing on a streaming platform, a mainstream streaming platform? What do you think?
Maybe eventually. Could be.
Okay.
I'd be happy, of course. I think that we've made a film that leaves you the choice of making up your own mind. And I think that's all that's needed to explore. But the main problem with a film going on television is that it opens up a can of worms as far as rights to footage and all the stuff, which you can get away with on a private streaming platform and outside of the mainstream. But as soon as you get into the mainstream television, the clearances, it's just a nightmare.
My gosh, what if they nominated you for an Oscar? Would you go? Or is it too mainstream for you?
I can't answer that. It depends what year on what timeline.
Fair enough, fair enough. Just curious, just curious. I don't know. You always have to ask the aspiring artist if that's the peak or whatever. But you know what? Yes. In the meanwhile, it doesn't. An Oscar isn't as important as fixing this timeline. So,
Yeah,
check out
right.
cyberhive.tv, the work of Frank Jacob, and A Tale of Two Timelines, the full 3-part video on demand webinar. Such interesting stuff. I'm grateful for what you do. Frank, this is great. I definitely would have loved to have you on again sometime.
We'll work it out. Thanks for having me. It's been fun talking to you.
Likewise, likewise.